Please have an opportunity. Okay, so please go and find your mat. Take it down. Oh, yeah, I changed it on my head because I find it a little tight. You standing in just in case I ask people to stand, Raymond? Good, you're resting in standing. Does that sound like a novel idea? Yes? So it is a capacity we have as we learn to more and more use our skeleton for support, that if our weight is being transferred to the ground rather than our musculature holding ourselves up, that we can learn to rest because we use the support of our skeleton. We rest into our bones, reduce the amount of muscular work, and it can feel like resting. So as you're lying this morning, what do you notice about your way of lying? What comes into your attention first? And are you letting your attention, your awareness drift around yourself? Or do you shift it, direct it, which is something that we can do from one place to another? Notice how your arms are lying, how much contact you have with the floor, with your right arm, with your left arm, how your two shoulders relate to the floor. Where do you feel the contact between your right shoulder blade and the floor and your left shoulder blade and the floor? Does one feel like it has a larger area of contact than the other? And is the contact in a similar location? Is it more towards the bottom angle of your shoulder blade or the inside edge, or more up towards the top of your shoulder blade, the spine of that little bony prominence that runs the width of your scapula and comes over to join with your clavicle? Does it feel like one shoulder blade is a little closer to your spine than the other? Sense the length of your spine, how much of it is in contact with the floor clearly, and those places where it's less clear, it's a bit hazy. Notice how your legs are lying today and the contact they make with the floor. And your ribs on either side of your spine. Do you sense any movement of your breathing at the back of you? Any subtle increase or changing pressure between your ribs on the right and the floor and the ribs on the left of the floor and the back? And what about the ribs that are lying on top of your shoulder blade on the right and the left right now? They're the ribs at the back of you, the middle and the upper ribs. But right now, they're resting above your shoulder blades. Do you feel any movement there as you breathe in or as you breathe out? And in the vertebra between your shoulder blades and the ribs on either side there. Please roll over and lie on your right side. Bend your hips and your knees so that you're lying comfortably. Put your left hand somewhere on the floor where it can support you. And notice how your right arm is lying on the floor now. Probably makes contact, the floor makes contact with a different part of your arm. Could you begin to slide your right arm on the floor a little bit downwards and a little bit upwards, keeping the elbow more or less comfortably long, straight? And as you do that, notice what you sense in your shoulder joint, in the contact with your right side and the floor. So it's not the left hand, it's the right arm. So you may remember, you may recall, if you were here last segment, or if you've done some of the audio material, that you did some lessons where you were circling your right arm on the floor underneath yourself. So don't do it immediately, but gradually begin to slide your right arm a little upward, higher on the floor, in the direction of above your head, and then in the direction downwards. Just notice, do you have your right hand palm up or palm down? So it's not bending and straightening the elbow, but sliding your arm upwards and downwards. And noticing the textures that you're passing over with either the back of your hand or the front of your hand. Okay, please leave that for a moment. And could you roll yourself up to sitting and come up to standing and go to a wall? I think we've got enough walls. Pillars will work, but stagger yourself around the walls for a moment. And you need a bit of space in front of yourself and a bit of space behind of yourself, so you don't want to be too close together. And stand with your right side against the wall, the right side of you against the wall. Now, here we've changed our relationship with gravity, and where your legs aren't in the same configuration, your hips and knees aren't bent. But could you begin to slide your right arm on the wall upwards, and your arms, most people have their arms hanging to begin with, but slide your arm upwards on the wall and come back down. And notice what you sense happening in yourself as you do this movement here. And gradually, could you slide your right arm higher so that your arm goes above your head And how could you use yourself, organize yourself to take your arm further behind you? So your right side is against the wall. What are you doing with your head and your eyes? What do your feet and legs and pelvis know about this action of your arm? Can you sense where your arm is from the change in contact of your feet on the ground or the movement of your pelvis and what's happening through the length of your spine? So when you take your arm upwards, is there a place where you sense that it becomes difficult to continue taking your arm backwards behind you? So what could you do with yourself in that moment? In the turning of your arm, in the turning of yourself, in the use of your eyes, your head, or your neck? So for most people, there's a place where they turn their hand palm down in order to make it possible to continue circling the arm backwards. What's happening through your thorax, your ribs, your spine, your pelvis and your hip joints? Can you feel how they are participating? And if they're not, how could they participate, be involved in a way that assists your arm to circle? So change directions. Same side, just change the direction of your circle. Now, if you had, so here we've got no constraints. Well, less constraints. You've got the plane of the wall, which is in the sagittal plane, the plane of the bicycle wheel. And this is one of the planes that our arm can move in, our shoulder joint can move in, and the shoulder girdle complex. But it's a beautiful ball and socket joint, and like the hip joint, our arm can move in 3 planes, which gives it freedom to move in all directions when all of ourselves are participating in the action that we're doing. So now, could you put the constraint on yourself that you stay on your side, that you put your pelvis, the right side of your pelvis against the wall, you glue it there, and then continue the circling with your right arm. And notice, by keeping your pelvis constrained, does that bring some other part of you into the action? Or does it limit, inhibit how far you can circle your arm? And now don't keep the constraint, but not as rigidly. So the glue is kind of tacky and it can stretch, more like chewing gum. So here, most of you are bringing your hand completely long. If you keep your pelvis a little bit more constrained, could you find a way to bring your hand backwards and then find a way to slide your hand but forwards again by coming underneath the ribs? Well, it's not, but beside your ribs. It would be underneath if it was on the floor, but here it's underneath. Okay, rest in standing. How many of, I've got to get somewhere where I can see it, most of you. How many of you remember doing this last segment? For those of you who do and have done this lesson, what's it like this time? Is it different to what it was the first time you explored it? Probably easier. Pardon? The wall's very useful. Good. So often when we begin teaching ATM classes, being able to adapt the lesson to magnify relationships or give people an easier context relationship can be really useful. So turn to the other side and find out how you can circle how you choose to explore circling your left arm on the wall. Can you feel the texture of the wall? How much of your attention is on the pathway of your hand in space, and how much of your attention is on what's happening through yourself? Is this side easier or more difficult? If you were lying on the floor, what would this look like? And can you identify the places that, without the weight and constraint of the floor, come into your way of moving that are perhaps a little more challenging to find on the floor? When do you turn your hand from being palm, the back of the hand on the wall, to palm on the wall? Do you wait till you feel you've kind of come to that place where you need to effort more, where it feels like the end? Or could you listen to the changing quality and find a moment where, if you invited that motion in, the quality would continue in a smoother, easier, simpler fashion? Change directions and think about putting that chewing gum between your pelvis and the wall, or lots of pieces of chewing gum. So you may feel your pelvis turning to the left a little bit. You may feel moments where the ribs on your left side and the ribs on your right side are doing slightly different things. Have you explored that pathway of coming through between yourself and the wall, more at the level of your waist? So as I mentioned last week, most of us will use the parts we know how to use well, or that are actually in our self-image, at least 5 times more than the parts that are outside of our awareness or are less clear to us, which means they're likely less differentiated. Okay, please leave it. Come and lie on your right side. Actually, lie on your back for a moment on the floor. One of the reasons we slow down when we're exploring in awareness through movement lessons is in order that we can discover places that in ourselves that are less involved, or actually holding or interfering with what we're intending to do. So notice your way of lying now. And if there's anything in your way of lying that reflects the movements that you've been doing. Maybe you have a heightened awareness of some place, or maybe your tonus has even changed a little and your shoulder girdle and arms lie a little differently. Or it could be something in your breathing, or it could be nothing at all. That's another possibility. Please roll over and lie on your right side. Bend your hips and knees up. Put your left hand on the floor in front of you, somewhere where it can support you or help you even. And begin to explore moving your right arm on the floor, a little bit upwards, a little bit downwards. Remembering the places that you sensed in yourself when you were doing this on the wall, and feel how can you bring them into your action. If your left hand is on the floor, it might support you if you roll a little forwards. If there's a moment where you need to lift something away from the floor, your left hand might help you. But as much as you can, you're lying on your side, your knees are bent up, which does provide a constraint, because it means you don't just roll forwards or backwards. And it invites the movement more through your shoulder girdle, your spine, and your ribs relative to one another than if you just roll as a log. And how do you find that pathway underneath yourself? When your arm is back of you, you bend your elbow, bring your fingers to the back of your waist. What do you do with your ribs and your spine? And you feel what shape your spine makes? Instead of being a line more or less parallel with the floor, can you feel you make a curve? Maybe it's something like the banana. It has some banana shape or quality of banana-ish shape. Change directions. And notice, is it a little easier for you finding the path of circling your arm on the floor, having done it against the wall? Maybe even if you were here for the ATM's last segment, you're remembering some sensations, some kinesthetic memories of how you involved yourself. Please leave it rest on your back. And as you come to lie on your back, notice if you sense any difference in the sensations of your right side and left side. That could be in the contact with the floor, or it could be in terms of volume or length or width. Please roll over and lie on your left side. Put your right hand on the floor in front of you. And slowly begin to explore the floor a little bit upwards and a little bit downwards. So I was delighted to hear from someone this morning that when I asked after their weekend and how they were doing, and they said they had recognized that this week they were going to do less. So maybe you could notice if that is useful to you. Is that something that maybe you thought of at the end of some ATM last week, but can you bring that concept, idea into how you're moving now? So that maybe you don't need to do a full circle eventually. Maybe for you and where you are now, exploring a quarter of the movement and shifting your attention to notice how you involve yourself would be the most useful learning for you now. What about your breathing? We talked last week about how our breathing, there's not a right way of breathing, but then our breathing needs to continue and have some sort of smooth flow in and out. Because if you stop your breath, if you take a little moment where you want to increase the effort, it's most likely that you'll hold your breath. And in holding your breath, you're using the muscles to contract, the very ones that would be helpful if they could lengthen in this particular movement. So if you can find those places where you're, instead of your hand moving like a smooth, continuous movement, it goes ha, ha, ha. Notice what you're doing with your breathing and find out if there's a way of keeping your breathing more forward in your attention that might influence the quality of motion in the range that you're exploring. So could you bring your left arm behind you? So most people can lie. So you lean on your right hand in front of you, bring your left arm behind you, down near your pelvis. So you're a little bit, and your knees are on top of what you're half on your side, half on your, a little bit turned to your stomach. Your right hand, is standing on the floor. And if your hand is standing, that means the elbow will be in the air and the forearm will be more or less vertical. Now in this position, bend your elbow and bring your hand somewhere near your waist. Don't go through, just bring it and begin the movement. And so your left arm is behind you on the floor. Your right hand is on the floor in front of you. Your elbow is bent and your fingertips are just somewhere near your waist or your lower ribs. And form the intention that you're going to slide your hand underneath your ribs, underneath your waist, and feel, what do you do through the middle of yourself? Does the distance between your right hip and your right shoulder change? And the distance between your left shoulder and left hip change? And so the right side could get longer or the right side could get shorter. The left side could get longer, the distance, or it could get shorter. Which one creates a space for your left hand to come under? Can you sense how your ribs on the left side need to lift away from the floor? But then there's so many ways of lifting away from the floor. The ribs could lift as a block, which means that you're probably pressing something very hard. Or they could make an arch where the smaller ones, the lower ribs, could lift a little more. The upper ones could slide down in the direction of your left hip to assist your spine to be able to create this curve. And then continue as it's comfortable for you to slide your arm forwards or play with a part of the circle that is most comfortable for you. Sensing how could you use more of yourself to make this action easier? How much do you need to lift your head away from the floor? So some people hardly lift their head away from the floor and use the head as if it's a lever, pushing it into the floor. And other people lift their head sideways. Is what you're doing necessary? Or is there another way? Okay, please leave it. Roll onto your back and pause a moment. And notice in your experience of yourself now and your contact with the floor, has doing the movements, exploring yourself, circling your left arm influenced how you experience yourself or your way of lying? Could you please roll over and lie on your left side? This time, if you need some support under your head, we're not going to continue circling the arm right now. You could use pads or towel or whatever makes you feel more comfortable and less strain, more at rest in your neck. Bend your knees up one on top of the other. Could you bring your right hand to your right kneecap, hold below your kneecap, and begin to move your right leg away from your left and bring it back down. And just notice that when you're given that first instruction, how high, how far do you choose to move your leg? How do you sense the weight of your leg this morning? And where do you sense this movement happening? So the hand on below your kneecap acts as a constraint. You may feel some movement in your hip joint. Your hip joint's involved, the right and the left, because as your right knee lifts away from your left, your pelvis begins to roll backwards a little bit, which means there's an opening, a changing angle in your left hip joint. Do you sense yourself rolling a little bit over the ribs, your ribs on the left side? And does the shape of your spine change? So when we're on our spine, when we're lying on our side, the spine has forwards and backwards curves, and the line of the spine often is relatively parallel with the floor. So as you lift your right knee away from the left, does your spine maintain its shape, its fixed shape like a stick, or do you feel a little change in the lumbar vertebra and a chain of motion traveling from your pelvis upwards through the length of your spine, so that there's some turning, rotating within your spine rather than a rolling of your whole back as one piece? Does it feel easier than last week? If you can, let your foot hang. So as your knee comes higher, your lower leg is not kept at the same angle. Your foot hangs down. Your knee bends. Yeah, that's it. Okay, take a rest on your side for a moment. And remember that you can rest anytime you need. The difficulty is listening to our own needs, listening to ourselves in a way that we can recognize when's enough for us to take a pause now, rather than in 5 or 10 or 15 movements' time. So the next time you lift your right leg away from your left, you're going to take it to 12 o'clock. So your knee will, on that elevator dial that we used last week, so your knee will be pointing towards the ceiling. Your hand is holding underneath your kneecap from the outside. Okay, and you stay as much as you can on your side for the moment to bring yourself into that position. So it may mean that you don't go to 12 if it's difficult, or that you do roll more onto your back if you need to, but that you know what you're doing to get there. And in this position, can you begin to move your right foot and your right lower leg like a pendulum? So you move your foot, your knee stays where it is, and your foot and lower leg move a little right and a little left. And the movement is happening around your hip joint. Your right hand is holding your knee relatively stationary in space. So how does a pendulum move? Okay, rest a moment. So with a pendulum, there's usually a weight on the bottom of some sort of long string or something that's got a length to it with the weight at the bottom. And that when it's set in motion, it slows as it goes up to the sides, and it gets faster through the middle. And the quality of the movement is smooth and continuous throughout its path. So bring your right knee, hold on to your right knee with your right hand again, bring it towards the ceiling, in the direction of the ceiling, and find out what sort of pendulum motion you can create with your right lower leg. And this is a movement that most of us haven't done for a long time. So the pendulum movement is not bending and extending your knee, but it's really a right-leftward motion that's happening in the hip joint. And then you'll feel some movement of your pelvis, perhaps, as it cooperates. As much as you can, your thigh is vertical. So it's not pulled to your chest. It's not folded in the hip joint, flexed in the hip joint. What other parts of yourself could you involve so you make it more and more pendular? That's it. But the more you can have it vertical, the thigh, yeah, there. So to have the thigh vertical, you need to allow your shoulder girdle to elongate, which demands something of your ribs and your sternum. So not down and away from you, but right and leftward. And some people are starting to get a little, you could make it smaller. Could you make it smaller and quicker? And really think that that your lower leg is swinging a little, to and fro, to and fro. And of course, you rest when you need to. Rest a moment, everybody. So anything that is unfamiliar to us, we need to learn how to do. And it requires what could be thought of as mistakes. But mistakes are actually an opportunity to recognize that's not what I wanted to do. How could I reorganize myself, my musculature, to enable myself, my skeleton, to move in the way I want with less effort and not more? Could you roll onto your right side, please? And hold on to your left knee with your left hand. Slowly, just explore the first movement of moving your left leg away from your right and bringing it back down. Notice, does that feel easier than last week? Or not? In my practice, one thing that I've noticed is that if clients can identify the shifts, learn to identify the shifts or improvements they make, it can assist their motivation for the future. But sometimes it's difficult, often when they begin, their attention is so focused on all that they want, their expectations, that recognizing the difference between one thing and another that has occurred is challenging for them. Remembering what the sensations, the kinesthetic experience was of doing it one way compared to another is difficult if your attention is stuck on the expectation of what you want rather than appreciating where you are. Rest a moment on your side. Can you think of some object that moves like a pendulum? So if you know those old grandfather clocks that had the big swinging, they have the pendulum that's you can see through the glass case, or a swing can move in a pendulum type fashion. So think about the pathway and the motion, the speed of the pendulum that you're imagining, and then keep some sense of that, idea of that, and bring your left knee towards the ceiling, away from your right, holding on below the kneecap, and begin to move your foot and lower leg in a pendular type way. So some of the pendulums I see have motion in one direction and not in the other. That's not unusual when you're exploring this movement and it's unfamiliar. It takes time to learn to reorganize ourselves, to find the unnecessary work. But for it to be a pendulum type action, the knee needs to be vertical. The thigh needs to be vertical. The knee needs to be pointing towards the ceiling. That's it. And how can you let your entire self be a part of that action? That means the side that you're lying on, the length of your spine, particularly your lower back, and the freedom of your breath. Can you make it a little faster? Try a faster motion. See if your right leg is lying on the floor and your foot is hanging down towards your buttock. So your foot is soft. And make it slower. Would it help if you smiled? Or if you were ready to smile? Does that change something in your attitude towards yourself? And how bent does your right leg need to be to keep you semi-stable so that you're not doing so much work to maintain this position? Okay, please leave that lie on your back. Notice what you sense in your hip joints, your shoulders, the length of your spine. And once more, could you lie on the side that you found it easier to circle your arm? Or move your arm in more of a circle? Lie on that side. I have never met someone who could use their two sides equally, totally equally. They might be able to use them functionally relatively equally, but not with necessarily the same ease or the same involvement, availability of themselves in the action. So lie on the side that's easier, put that upper hand on the floor again, and see what it's like to move your underneath arm in a circular path. And where can your left hand help? Where can you put your left hand that helps? Staying on your side as much as you are able, but not at the expense of your comfort or ease. Just see if it's a little easier now. Can you move yourself, explore this movement at the speed which allows you to attend to the rest of yourself, to what's happening in your shoulder joint, between your shoulder blade and your ribs, your shoulder blade and your spine, your ribs and your sternum, the shapes that they make, the changing contact with the floor. When you turn your palm over, when you turn your palm down and when you turn your palm up. How is your head involved? What are you doing with your eyes? Can you sense the spaces between your toes? The movement of one foot on the other? In your hip joints? Okay, and change directions. And notice, can you identify why you chose the first direction? The first direction to move in? So your arm stays as long as it can, except when it goes underneath your waist. Okay, let that go, roll over and lie on your back. Take a moment to sense again how you're experiencing yourself now. Gently roll your head a little right, a little left. Observing what's a little to you. Some people's idea of a little is to take the one ear to the floor and then the other ear to the floor. Maybe that is little. Maybe they can turn their head all the way around. But a little means a small percentage of what you could do. Okay. Please roll yourself to one side. Bring yourself in your own time up to standing. Take a moment to notice in standing if this exploring this lesson has influenced your way of standing. Do you feel are you any more restful in standing? If that makes any sense to you. How do your arms hang? How are your arms hanging? And where are they hanging? They're hanging a little more forwards or backwards than usual. And go for a walk and walk yourself towards the morning tea or coffee, bathroom stop, and we'll take a 15-minute break.